Harvard, and she starts...
It was raining the night they found her. Not a violent storm, just a persistent, almost theatrical drizzle that clung to the windows of the small Los Angeles apartment. A silent kind of rain, the sort that seems to seep through time itself. Inside, the lights were off, the TV still flickering faintly from the living room. And in the bathroom, the door was closed but unlocked. The handle turned without resistance. Michelle Trachtenberg was there, in the bathtub, fully clothed. There was no blood, no bruising. Her face, pale and almost serene, leaned just slightly to the right, as if she had simply slipped into a warm nap and forgotten to wake. The bathwater had long since gone cold, and her lips were faintly blue. The silence in that room felt unnatural, as though something essential had been erased. Beside the sink, her phone rested quietly, screen dark, untouched since 8:59 p.m. The last app open was her notes. The last note read only, "Let it stay quiet." She had made no calls, no texts, not to her sister, not to her agent, not to anyone. The mirror above the sink was fogged over, but only halfway. The bottom half had been wiped clean, just once, by a hand moving downward. You could still see the faint streaks, like something left unfinished. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no pill bottles tipped over in despair, no note of farewell. The front door was locked from the inside. Everything neat, everything quiet. Her cat, Elliot, was found crouched on the hallway windowsill, staring at nothing. The official report, filed the next morning, labeled the cause of death as pending. Toxicology was incomplete. Vital organs had shown minor inflammation, consistent with her recent liver transplant, but nothing conclusive. And yet, her family refused a full autopsy. No dissection, no deeper examination. On religious grounds, they said. But others weren't so sure. There was a stillness around her that unsettled even the paramedics. One of them, anonymously quoted later in an off-record interview, said, "It was like she disappeared before we got there. Like the body had been empty for hours, but somehow still warm." The television played an old episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Michelle was on screen 15, maybe 16, delivering a line that, in context, meant nothing. But heard in that moment, in that room, it felt like a whisper from the past. People think silence is peaceful, but sometimes silence screams. And there, in the flicker of the screen, a strange symmetry took shape. She had begun her career in bathtubs, in commercials for bubble bath, smiling wide beneath foamy water. Later, as Harriet the Spy, scribbling secrets in the bath. Even as a young adult in Ice Princess, she cried alone in a tub, rejected and raw. Always the bath, always the water, as if that was the place she returned to when no one else could see her. What does it mean when a place of cleansing becomes a place of death? What does it mean when a girl who lived her entire life on camera chooses to die in a room with no mirrors? A whisper from the coroner's notes, barely legible in a corner of the page, reads, "No signs of trauma, no signs of peace." There are stories where the mystery is loud, where doors are broken and screams pierce the dark. This isn't one of those stories. This is the kind of story where the mystery tiptoes in, where the answers don't hide behind locked doors, but in small, precise absences, like a message half sent, a mirror half wiped, a bathtub, still and silent. Before she was a tragedy, she was a face everyone knew. Michelle Trachtenberg entered the world of cameras early, not through scandal or ambition, but because she fit what the frame, the storyboards, the vague idea adults had about what innocence should look like. Big, solemn eyes, naturally serious, smiles that seemed practiced even when they weren't. She began acting at 3 years old, not talking to strangers, but performing for them. Her mother, Lana, a Russian immigrant, managed her early career with the precision of a stage mother, but none of the flamboyance. Michelle wasn't pushed, She was protected. That's what people always said. A quiet household in Brooklyn. A father who worked as a fiber optics engineer. Their girl was talented and serious, and just lucky enough to be noticed. At 7, she booked a recurring role on All My Children. At 9, she was the quirky lead in Harriet the Spy. By 14, she was sharing scenes with Sarah Michelle Gellar in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And always she played the complicated girl. The girl who watched instead of spoke. The one people underestimated. The character who arrived too late or saw too much. It was art imitating life. Or maybe it was the other way around. On set, she was polite, professional, never late. She memorized entire scripts before the first table read. Adults praised her for being mature beyond her years. But that phrase, when said too often, starts to sound like a kind of curse. Because Michelle didn't grow up. Not really. Not emotionally. Not in public. She advanced. Yes, but as an image. The world saw her as precocious, reserved, vaguely melancholic. She never gave interviews that revealed much. No viral moments, no breakdowns, no rumors. Just a quiet unfolding. A former co-star once said, "Michelle was the kind of girl who was always listening to music no one else could hear." Another director described her presence as haunted, but functional. Fame is a peculiar shape to grow up inside, especially when you grow up being watched, especially when your best traits, your seriousness, your introspection get monetized. By her 20s, Michelle had slipped from the front pages, not in disgrace, but in stillness. A cameo here, a small part there. Nothing that demanded transformation, nothing that required her to become something else. She wasn't cast for who she could become, but for who people remembered her to be. And people remembered, always remembered. But remembering is not the same as seeing. And Michelle, it seems, had not felt seen in years. There is a photo from her early 30s that surfaces now and then. She's sitting on a park bench, hands in the sleeves of a faded hoodie, reading a book with no title on the cover. The photographer claimed it was candid, but the look on her face slightly turned. Eyes fixed, just off camera says otherwise. It's the look of someone who knows they're being watched and has decided not to react. Between 2020 and 2025, Michelle gave no interviews. She posted no videos. She attended no reunions. Her IMDb page remained frozen in time. And in those years, she underwent at least one major surgery, possibly more. A liver transplant in 2024, confirmed in quiet terms by her agent, though no reason was publicly disclosed. She lived alone. She walked her cat. She was seen buying chamomile tea, always in the same scarf, always with headphones. Neighbors called her gentle, even sweet, but unapproachable. One neighbor described seeing her through the window once, long after midnight, simply sitting on the floor with her head resting against the wall. No phone, no book, no movement, just sitting. And above her, a wall covered in pictures, old movie stills, childhood photos, framed articles from a time when people asked questions about her on talk shows. Fame is often imagined as a ladder, something you climb and climb. But for Michelle, it might have been a glass box where the air thinned slowly, and no one noticed until it was almost gone. She had once said, quietly, when asked about growing up in Hollywood, "It's like being a voice in someone else's dream. You remember how to speak, but not what it's for." Long after her final credits rolled, the world continued to remember her. But memory, like fame, is never whole. Sometimes, it forgets what the person became. Sometimes, it never knew at all. They found them in a drawer she rarely used, tucked beneath old scripts. A wrist brace from an injury on set, and a single yellowed postcard from Brighton, dated 2001. There were 27 of them in total. Each one folded, unsealed, written in her small, upright handwriting. Not a single envelope bore a name. Not one letter carried a date. They all began the same way. I'm sorry you had to see me like this. The letters were not suicide notes, not in any conventional sense. Some read like apologies, others like confessions, but most were strange hybrids of memory and half-finished thought. She wrote of things that happened and things that might have, about dreams repetitive, spiraling, vivid. In one letter, she described a recurring image, a hallway lined with mirrors, but none of them showed her reflection. I keep opening doors to the wrong rooms. The mirrors are blank. I knock, and no one hears. It's not loneliness exactly. It's like being erased while you're still awake. Some letters addressed her mother, others, perhaps, an old friend or a director. One seemed to be written to a younger version of herself, signed only with a lowercase. In that one, she wrote, "They will love you for being quiet, and then they'll hate you for disappearing." The letters weren't stored neatly. Some were folded crisply, others wrinkled and ink-smudged, as though written in moments of indecision. A few had small tears along the edge ripped open, maybe, or folded too tightly by nervous hands. One was water-damaged, not from rain, but from within the apartment. Possibly the bathroom, possibly tears. Investigators documented the discovery, photographed the stack, but ultimately dismissed the letters as non-evidentiary. They didn't suggest intent. They didn't name a suspect. They were emotional reflections. The report said, indicative of a complex mental state. But what kind of state? A therapist, who once worked briefly with Michelle in her 20s, later said she'd always feared her client was living in a kind of narrative dissonance. She understood story arcs better than reality. She didn't process events. She framed them. It's not an uncommon fate among performers, especially those who've played too many versions of themselves before they've even become one. Some of the letters held a peculiar rhythm, repeated words, echoes. One of them mentioned a clock that had stopped ticking on the day of her transplant. She wrote, "I keep resetting it, but it only tells me what time I should have died." Another letter hinted at surveillance, though no evidence of that was ever confirmed. I know you're still watching. I just don't know why. None of the letters mentioned names, no accusations, no cries for help. But there was something quieter in them, something more unsettling than alarm, a kind of resignation, the tone of someone not preparing to die, but preparing to be misremembered. In one, she wrote, "If they ask, tell them I was tired, not sad, not sick, just exhausted from pretending to be both." And in another, "Please don't make this into a movie. There's something eerie about written words left behind. They outlive the body, outlive intention. They echo in rooms now silent. They begin to feel like whispers from a hallway you can't find your way back to." When a young assistant from the coroner's office filed the letters into a sealed box, she noticed something else, a faint scent clinging to the page's lavender, and something metallic. Old perfume, perhaps. Or maybe just the trace of ink and time. The letters were returned to the family. No copies made public, no statement released. But the phrase remained, 27 beginnings, all the same. I'm sorry you had to see me like this. And what does it say when a person imagines their final moment, not as escape, but as exposure? Not death, but being seen too clearly, too late. The hospital room was white in the way only hospitals can be over-sanitized, humming with hidden machines, a kind of artificial stillness that doesn't soothe so much as numb. Michelle had been admitted quietly, under an alias she had used before, Eleanor G. No paparazzi, no press release. The transplant, her agent would later claim, was routine and successful. But the word routine seems almost cruel in retrospect. Michelle never wanted the surgery. It was a liver transplant necessary, according to her doctors, due to a rare autoimmune condition that had gone undiagnosed for years. But close friends described her as terrified, not of dying, but of what might change. She feared the anesthesia, feared memory loss, feared waking up someone else, In a journal entry found later on her iPad, Michelle wrote, "It feels like opening your body to strangers and hoping they give it back to you in the same shape." She delayed it twice, once claiming a scheduling conflict, once citing a sudden fever, but it eventually happened in spring 2024, and for a time, things seemed stable. She posted a filtered photo of the view from her hospital window, clouds gathering above the Los Angeles skyline, and captioned it simply with a spiral emoji. Only 2 people visited her during her stay, her sister, and someone listed in the nurse's log as V. No last name, no clear connection. The nurse remembered Michelle seemed tense around that visitor alert, eyes scanning corners of the room, smiling too often. When she was discharged, Michelle moved into a different apartment, same neighborhood, but 1 floor higher. She told her landlord she wanted more light, but she never opened the blinds. Not once. There was something else, too. A strange detail in the medical notes. After the surgery, Michelle refused all pain medication stronger than over-the-counter acetaminophen. Not out of fear of addiction, but something else. "I don't want to forget anything," she told the nurse. "I want to feel what they did." That same nurse, interviewed years later under a pseudonym, recalled an odd moment during discharge. Michelle had requested a printout of her operative report, not the summary, the entire document, including timestamps, surgeon notes, and anesthesia dosages. Most patients wouldn't even understand it, but Michelle read every line before leaving. She circled a phrase in red ink procedure extended due to minor complication. She never asked what the complication was. She just circled it, twice. Friends who saw her in the weeks after the surgery said she seemed dulled, as if something behind her eyes had gone distant. She walked slower. She held her stomach protectively, even when she laughed. Her hair, once always curled and styled, was now left unbrushed. Tucked into a knit cap she wore even indoors, a subtle shift. But to those who knew her well, it felt seismic. And then there was the mirror. Her sister, who stayed with her for a weekend, recalled that Michelle had covered every mirror in the apartment with black silk scarves. The bathroom, the hallway, even the compact in her makeup bag. "I don't like the way I look at myself now," she said. "Not I don't like how I look. I don't like the way I look at myself." There's something chilling in that sentence. A kind of doubling. As if her reflection no longer felt like her own, or worse, as if it had begun watching her back. And perhaps it had. Survivors of organ transplants sometimes speak of a strange sensation in the months afterward. A subtle shift in appetite, dreams, even moods. Some believe the body remembers more than we admit, that somewhere in our flesh, there are stories still echoing from previous owners. Stories we can't name, but which shape the way we move, speak, and fear. Michelle never talked about the donor. The hospital never revealed their identity. But in one of her final messages sent at 3:17 a.m., and never opened, she wrote to an unnamed recipient, "It doesn't feel like mine, not the liver, the time." What does it mean to survive something you never wanted? What happens when healing leaves a person more fragmented than before? She had survived the surgery. That much was true. But from that moment on, Michelle seemed to live in parentheses, alive, but not returned, like a character brought back in the wrong scene, like a voice echoing from someone else's body. The night Michelle died, she came home alone, a black umbrella folded under her arm, her steps quiet, deliberate. Security footage from the building's lobby showed her entering at exactly 8:41 p.m. She nodded to the front desk attendant, offered a soft smile, then turned down the corridor toward the elevator. She was wearing a gray sweater, dark jeans, and scuffed sneakers, the same ones found beside the tub hours later, dry and neatly placed. She took the elevator to the 9th floor. The doors opened. She stepped out. And then the footage ends. The timestamp freezes at 8:58 p.m. A black screen follows. No footage from the hallway. No record of her walking into her apartment. No sign of anyone else. When questioned, the building's technician blamed a power calibration error, a flicker in the surveillance system that had affected just 3 minutes of footage from that floor. It was dismissed as a fluke, but the power in the rest of the building remained stable, and the footage from the garage, lobby, and even stairwells remained untouched. The window between 8:58 and 10:03, the time her upstairs neighbor reported hearing water running for too long, became a silent gap. 64 minutes. 64 minutes vanished into static. Inside her apartment, everything appeared in order. No forced entry, no scuff marks, no signs of struggle. The door was deadbolted from the inside. All windows locked. No emergency calls were made. Her phone's location history ended in the bathroom. Not a single digital trace was left after she stepped into that room. And yet, there were small anomalies. The bath mat was soaked, but her clothes were dry. The radio in her bedroom had been unplugged. Its cord wound 3 times around itself, then tucked beneath a pillow. A glass of water sat on the kitchen counter, untouched but filled just high enough to suggest it was poured with intention. And then, there was the mirror. In the bathroom, above the sink. The mirror bore no fingerprints, no smudges. But when forensics scanned it with an oblique light source, they discovered something chilling, a faint outline of a handprint. Not full, just the curve of the palm and fingertips, pressed near the top right corner, as if someone had steadied themselves briefly before turning away. The handprint was too small to belong to a man, too narrow to be Michelle's. More haunting still was the positioning of the fingers, slightly splayed, almost. Reaching. A former crime scene investigator, brought in for independent analysis, described the scene as architected absence. He said, "It's like someone cleaned up without knowing what they were erasing." On her nightstand, the alarm clock had stopped at 9:43 p.m. Not blinking, not flashing, just frozen. The battery still functional. The plug still in the socket. No power surge, no explanation. Across from the clock, a single framed photo faced the wall. When turned over, it revealed a black and white portrait of Michelle on the set of Buffy, her first episode. Eyes downcast, the clapperboard just visible in the corner. Someone had written on the back, in ballpoint pen, "Day 1. Keep something for yourself." It's unclear who wrote it. Of all the questions raised in that quiet apartment, the most unnerving was perhaps this. If Michelle locked the door, ran the bath, and left her phone untouched, what exactly happened in those missing 64 minutes? And more crucially, was she alone? No trace evidence suggested otherwise. No hair, no foreign prints. And yet the apartment carried that strange feeling. The feeling of breath just exhaled, of something recently present and now gone. Sometimes, absence is louder than presence. Sometimes, the most important part of a story is the one that can't be filmed. In the police report, one line stands out, scribbled in a detective's rushed handwriting beneath the last interview notes. Door was locked, everything inside normal, but she didn't look like someone who died alone. The morning after her death, the coroner's office made its usual call. It was procedure, a necessary formality. In cases like this, especially when the cause of death is unclear, a full autopsy is typically performed within 24 hours. But the voice on the other end of the line interrupted before the sentence could be finished. "We're declining the autopsy," said Michelle's sister, her voice flat but unwavering. "It's against our beliefs." The medical examiner paused. This wasn't unheard of, especially in cases involving religious observance. But Michelle had never been publicly affiliated with any tradition that strictly forbade post-mortem examination. The examiner pressed gently, explaining the inconclusiveness of the initial findings. The sister insisted. The request was filed under objection by next of kin. and the examination was limited to external observation and toxicology screening. No internal dissection, no cranial examination, no preservation of organs. The body was released the following day, cremated within 48 hours. Whatever secrets Michelle's body held were turned to ash before they could be asked a single question. Her death certificate listed the cause as undetermined. No evidence of trauma, no fatal toxicity, no definitive pathology. A line of silence carved across a page that should have told the truth. Behind closed doors, some within the coroner's office whispered suspicions not of criminal cover-up, but of emotional shielding. One technician wrote in her personal log, "Family wanted the silence, more than the truth." But why? At the funeral, there were no paparazzi, no eulogies posted online, no colleagues spoke publicly, no red carpet retrospectives, no media montages, just a small chapel in the valley, pale light filtering through dusty windows, and fewer than 20 people in attendance. Someone brought lilacs, someone else brought lavender. The whole place smelled like spring, but out of season like something blooming when it shouldn't. Among the mourners were a few faces from her early life, a voice coach, an old casting director. None spoke to the press. No interviews were given, but the silence said enough. Michelle's mother, Lana, sat nearest the urn, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face impassive, nearly waxen. It was said she never cried, not at the service, not after. "We have to protect her memory," she told the one reporter who managed to get through. She was private. Let her stay that way. But others saw something different. One attendee, who asked to remain anonymous, recalled the moment the urn was carried to its final resting place. Lana rose from her seat, approached the small vessel, and whispered something no one could quite hear. Then she placed a tiny object beside it, a music box in the shape of a carousel horse, its paint chipped with age. It was the same box Michelle had once mentioned in an interview at age 10. "It plays a lullaby I can't remember the name of," she'd said. "But I always leave it open at night. It keeps the shadows out." When the music box was later retrieved for cataloging, the tune inside had long since stopped working. The cylinder would turn, but no notes played. Just a soft, whirring mechanical and empty. Something about the refusal of the autopsy lingered in the minds of those closest to her. Some believed it was an act of compassion. Others suspected fear. A few wondered if the truth was simply too heavy to bear. That to cut into her into what was left would be to open a wound that had already been bleeding quietly for years. And there was another layer, in private. One family friend hinted that Michelle had once left instructions in the event anything happens. "Don't let them open me." She feared being dissected, not out of vanity, but because she believed the body could carry grief too deeply. That some memories should stay buried in the skin. She didn't want to be made into a story. She didn't want to be explained. But what does that mean in a world that feeds on explanation? There is a particular cruelty in how we remember the dead. We want answers. We demand them. And when they don't come, we fill in the silence with theory, suspicion, myth. In the absence of truth, we tell ourselves stories not to understand the lost, but to feel less helpless in the losing. Michelle left behind no confession, no diagnosis, no public struggle. Just a girl who had once been famous, who grew quieter with each passing year, and whose family decided her silence should remain intact, even in death. The autopsy would never happen. The answers would not come. All that remained was a sealed urn, a broken music box, and a room full of people pretending not to hear the questions still echoing between them. The studio lots where Michelle once filmed now hold quieter ghosts. During her early years on sets like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Gossip Girl, she was known as the professional always on time, always off book, always watching more than she spoke. But among crew members, there were other memories moments that had once seemed small, forgettable. but which now resurfaced with uneasy clarity. A lighting technician from 17 Again, where Michelle played a supporting role in 2009, remembered a day when she suddenly froze mid-scene. The cameras rolled. Zac Efron improvised. But Michelle stood still, staring just to the left of the lens, her eyes wide, her breathing shallow. The director called cut. Someone laughed nervously. Michelle apologized, said she'd just lost the thread. But afterward, she sat alone in the soundstage's far corner, notebook clutched to her chest, scribbling something no one saw. That same notebook would appear in later productions, small, leather-bound, filled with coded marks and pages of lines rewritten by hand. She always wrote her scripts out in ink, even when she'd already memorized them. One assistant described it as her ritual, as if she needed to reassert that the words were hers before she could say them aloud. But toward the end of her on-screen life, the whispers shifted. A set medic on a short-lived series in 2015 claimed Michelle suffered a seizure between takes. Not a full collapse, just a moment of sudden rigidity. Her jaw clenched, hands trembling. When it passed, she insisted it was a panic attack. No hospital, no report. But the showrunner allegedly began rewriting her scenes to minimize screen time. Then there was the voicemail. In the weeks before her death, Michelle left a message for someone involved in a past project. No one has confirmed who received it. But multiple sources speaking off record claimed the message was deleted before police could retrieve it. The call, placed at 1:31 lasted only 34 seconds. Her voice was described as calm, flat, tired. One sentence was remembered. "I think I was followed after the meeting. Please just make sure it's off the books." No context, no follow-up. But when police attempted to trace the number she called, it was found to be disconnected, registered to a burner phone that had never made another call. What meeting with whom? One theory, quiet and unproven, began to take shape among those who worked with her in later years, that Michelle had attempted to re-enter the industry shortly before her death. A rumored pitch, a proposed memoir, a voiceover role she was promised but never signed for. There were emails sent to old agents, polite, measured. "I'm thinking of doing something again, but on my terms." But each message was followed, days later, by silence. A production manager from a past TV series mentioned a strange encounter at a coffee shop, months before Michelle's death. She approached him unexpectedly, ordered nothing, and asked only one question. "Do you remember who wrote the final rewrite for episode 4? He didn't. She nodded, said, "That's okay," and walked out. She left behind a napkin, folded once, with only a single line written on it. "There were things they told me not to say." The studio she filmed at most often. Stage 12 Warner Bros. Now has a new show occupying her former lot. But a few grips and carpenters still working there remember her. They recall how she always brought her own teacup to set, porcelain with a crack down the side. They remember she preferred silence between takes, even when others tried to fill it. They remember, too, how her trailers were always the same bookshelves, blackout curtains, and a small framed quote above the mirror. The quote read, "There is no safety in being seen." After her death, a production intern found the same quote typed onto a sheet of paper, taped inside a filing cabinet in a prop room she once used. The ink had faded, but the message lingered. Somewhere between performance and privacy, Michelle had begun to disappear. She had not withdrawn in a sudden act of self-erasure, but in slow steps, with measured pauses. One line not delivered, one phone call unanswered, one script turned down, one more minute behind the curtain, until even the spotlight forgot where she'd stood. The cameras had once loved her, but what the cameras love, they do not protect. What they remember, they do not understand. And when they forget completely until something breaks the silence again. In the age of hypervisibility, Michelle Trachtenberg became a ghost long before she died. Between 2018 and 2025, she posted exactly 9 times to her public social media accounts. All 9 were curated filtered images of sunsets, coffee cups, the occasional book cover, not a single selfie, not a single caption that included her face or her voice. She followed no one. She replied to no comments. To her tens of thousands of followers, Michelle was a digital shadow evidence of presence, but no proof of life. Her fans, nostalgic for her early roles, kept her image alive in meme pages and fan accounts. Where is she now became a recurring thread on forums. Conspiracies bloomed that she had moved to Iceland, joined a cult, suffered a breakdown, become a recluse out of shame or illness. But the truth was more muted. She was there always. There. Same city. Same streets. Just slipping quietly through the cracks of public attention. Her absence wasn't a disappearance. It was a decision. She had once said in a long-forgotten interview, "Fame makes you wear your own face like a mask. Eventually, you forget how to take it off." By the time she was 35, Michelle avoided cameras entirely. She declined press for anniversary reunions. She ignored invitations to conventions and declined podcast guest spots that promised to celebrate her legacy. Behind closed doors, she kept a storage unit, not for furniture, for photos, stacks of headshots, framed posters, VHS tapes of shows where her face had once been a national fixture. One shelf, according to the unit's inventory, was labeled "Others' Versions of Me." Another box bore a single word in black marker erature. The only photo framed in her apartment at the time of her death was not of herself. It was a still image from a 1960s art film, Persona, by Ingmar Bergman. The frame captured the moment when 2 women's faces seem to blur into one, when the self and the other become indistinguishable. Visitors to her apartment, few and far between, described a strange symmetry in the layout. Curtains always drawn, walls mostly bare, bookshelves filled with fiction in translation. Elena Ferrante, Clarice Lispector, Albert Camus. No awards on display, no memorabilia, just a mirror in the hallway, turned to face the wall. A neighbor once asked her why. She smiled faintly. It's not good to keep looking, but maybe the deeper question wasn't why Michelle turned away from being seen, but why she ever allowed it in the first place. From childhood, she was watched, admired, consumed. Her image distributed across magazine covers, press kits, streaming platforms. Millions of eyes memorized her face before she ever fully knew it herself. And over time, something shifted. The face the world loved became foreign to her. A thing she had to perform, preserve, and eventually reject. What does it mean to be known by a version of yourself you don't recognize? Michelle lived inside that question. It shaped her decisions. Her retreat wasn't dramatic. It was methodical. She canceled photo shoots, refused red carpets, declined comment when old clips went viral. When a popular fashion blog listed her among the forgotten IT girls of the 2000s, she sent no complaint. She didn't correct the narrative, because correction would mean re-entry, and she had chosen the opposite. Still, there were traces. Security footage from a bookstore in Silver Lake captured her in early 2025. She wore a long beige coat, sunglasses even indoors. She bought a copy of On the Marionette Theater by Heinrich von Kleist, a book about how puppets move with more grace than humans because they are unaware of how they appear. At checkout, she smiled once at the cashier. It was not the kind of smile offered for friendliness. It was the practiced flicker of someone who has not forgotten how to perform, but resents being asked. She left the store before anyone recognized her, if anyone did at all. A girl who once lit screens with adolescent intensity now walked Los Angeles like someone trying not to leave footprints. Her retreat was not a surrender. It was a reclamation, the kind that goes unnoticed until it's complete. But the question remains, Can you disappear completely when the world still carries your face? In the final days before she died, Michelle seemed to move through her apartment as if time had loosened its grip. There were small, strange details. The books on her shelves had been reorganized not by author or genre, but by memory. Some were flagged with sticky notes that read, "Don't reread," while others had pages dog-eared near passages about forgetting, dissociation, and self-erasure. A book of Eastern European folk tales lay open on her nightstand. A single line underlined in pencil. She left her shadow at the well and walked home alone. On the closet floor, tucked beneath a stack of worn blankets, police discovered a pair of ballet flats, mud-stained, water-warped, still slightly damp, not a style she had worn in years. The soles had begun to separate. They smelled faintly of mildew and rain. Michelle hadn't taken dance classes since she was a teenager. There was no recent record of her attending studios or gyms. No one recalled seeing her in them recently. Yet the shoes had been used. Often. Worn enough that the insoles had conformed to her arch again. A surveillance camera from a block away, dated just a week before her death, showed a woman walking in the early morning light, shoulders hunched, coat too thin. She wore black ballet flats. She walked without destination, circling a city park 3 times before disappearing behind a construction fence. There was a note in one of her journals that read simply, "I thought if I moved the same way I used to, something might come back, but I forgot what I was trying to remember." The body carries its own archive. In the medical files obtained during the investigation, Michelle had been treated for episodes of fainting and unexplained fatigue following her transplant. But what caught attention was an earlier pattern, dozens of small visits. Scattered over years, neck stiffness, trembling hands, vision episodes, dissociative spells. A neurologist had once suggested conversion symptoms, the body reacting to unresolved psychological trauma. Another recommended psychiatric evaluation, but there is no indication she ever followed through. What she did do, however, was keep meticulous records. Not in a traditional journal, but on small, spiral-bound notepads filled with what she called body reports. Each entry listed the date, time, room temperature, pulse rate, and one-line reflections. Hands cold. Can't remember the word for mirror. Back pain. Smelled lavender again, nowhere in the room. Left side, tremor. Dreamed of tunnels. Some of these notes trailed off mid-sentence. Others ended in question marks. One entry, dated 3 days before her death, simply read, "Someone else is remembering this for me." Psychologists call this somatic memory, when the body retains impressions, even when the mind suppresses them. It's most often observed in survivors of trauma. The past doesn't return as narrative, but as sensation. A shoulder tightens. A taste turns sour. A scent reopens a wound. Michelle, by all available accounts, never publicly claimed trauma, but she left behind its echoes in her avoidance of mirrors, her refusal to be touched on set, her shift away from speech, her fixation on handwriting. She communicated less with language and more with objects carefully chosen, deliberately placed. A social worker once remarked that survivors often build little shrines to the unspoken. Places, smells, textures that hold pieces of themselves too painful to name. Michelle's apartment was full of such shrines. A broken ceramic teacup on the windowsill. A folded coat she hadn't worn in years, still draped over the same chair. A post-it on her bathroom cabinet. Don't close your eyes too long. Even her cat, Elliot, had developed peculiar behavior, pawing at the hallway mirror nightly at the same time, then running to the bathtub and mewing softly. A pattern noted by her sister in a quiet interview. She said, it was like he was trying to get her attention, or someone else's. The mystery of Michelle's death was never one of violence or spectacle. It was the quieter kind, the erosion of self across time, a slow drift toward silence that no one marked until it became permanent. And perhaps the most chilling thought is this: what if Michelle didn't die from anything the body could prove? What if the thing that killed her couldn't be found under a microscope or in a toxicology screen? What if it was simply too many days where the body remembered what the mind refused to hold, where feeling replaced narrative, where shadows moved in places no one else could see, where even the softest shoes could carry the weight of forgotten wounds? In the days that followed Michelle's cremation, nothing moved in the apartment. The lights remained off. The curtains, always drawn, remained that way. Her landlord waited weeks before entering to begin the clean-out. When he did, he moved slowly, as if the air itself had memory. He later said the place didn't feel abandoned. It felt paused, like she had simply stepped out for a walk and might return at any moment. Quiet as always, smiling faintly, cat in tow. There was no conclusive cause of death, no final diagnosis. The autopsy was blocked. The toxicology was clean. The coroner's report read like a shrug dressed in medical language. But death rarely announces itself with clarity, not when it's been building like fog. Michelle's case was never ruled a suicide. There was no note, no history of mental illness. And yet, the absence of answers invited speculation. The tabloids circled. Fan forums bloomed with amateur detectives and armchair pathologists. Her name trended for a week, her face resurfacing as a cautionary tale or fallen icon. But what if Michelle wasn't a warning? What if she wasn't a mystery? What if she was a mirror? A mirror for a world that devours its quiet girls, that celebrates the mysterious but punishes the withdrawn, that wants performers who vanish from view but still light up when called upon. And she did vanish, in her way. Slowly, deliberately. Not to escape, but to retreat into a version of herself the world no longer demanded. There was no violence in her death, but that doesn't make it peaceful. Some absences bleed without ever breaking the skin. She wasn't consumed by scandal, addiction, or public collapse. Hers was a death by accumulation of silence, of erasure, of too many days spent playing someone else until the original faded. We do not talk enough about these deaths, the ones where the world says nothing happened, but something was clearly lost, where life shrinks inch by inch until it fits inside the space between who you are and who people remember. What if Michelle was not haunted, but haunting? What if she spent her final years walking through the echo of a life lived too early, too publicly, too loudly, only to crave a silence that no one would let her keep? There's a word used in folklore, revenant. It means one who returns, not to hurt, but to be noticed, to be named, to be remembered differently than the narrative suggests. Michelle was not a ghost, but she lived like one half present, half erased, and in the end, perhaps that was the greatest sorrow, not that she disappeared, but that the world couldn't bear her quiet. They called her disappearance a mystery. They whispered of tragedy. They spun stories in the dark, but the truth may be simpler, more devastating. She died the way she lived, not as a spectacle, but as an afterimage, still water, half light. A voice heard faintly down the hall, calling back to a girl no longer there. She was not a question to be answered. She was a life asking better questions than the world was willing to hear. And now, somewhere in the quiet corners of this city, where shadows gather gently against curtained windows and mirrors face the wall, her story lingers, not unresolved, but unfinished.